What's up guys, it's Rowan here from Artismart TV. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you the 3 key tips that you can use to support your child ace the OC and selective school testing in New South Wales. Now, before we dive in and unpack how you can support your child, we sort of need to actually first start with a little bit of an understanding of what the OC, opportunity class test, and the selective test actually involve. And then once we've sort of painted that in big picture of what each involves, we're going to dive in and we're going to look at 3 things that you as a parent can do to really help your child become more confident and better equipped to excel in these tests so they can open up opportunities for them both in the OC classes and in the selective school system in New South Wales. So let's dive in and start with that overview on what the OC and selective school tests are all about. So the first thing we need to just unpack really quickly is what is the OC and the selective tests. So the OC test is a test that Year 4 students take. Now they'll take it before entering Year 5 the following year. Now opportunity classes, that's what OC stands for, and they're located in government primary schools. In particular, they cater for academically gifted students in Years 5 and 6 with high potential. And so essentially the idea behind these OC classes is that what they're trying to do is group students that have high potential of academically gifted backgrounds and group them in classes so they can get specialized teaching methods and educational materials to really support them for the level that they're at. Now, there are 76 primary schools with opportunity classes across New South Wales, and the OC test itself from 2021 has been a computer-based test that is roughly 60 minutes in length. So that's what the OC test is. Let's now quickly unpack separately what the selective schools test is. Now, the selective schools test is generally held every year in March, and it's done by Year 6 students now who are entering Year 7 in the next year. Now, it can be and will be held every year, and there are spots that will continue to become available in Years 8 to 11 at selective schools that are often quite sought after afterwards when students are already at high school. Now, selective high schools are sort of similar in some respects to the idea behind opportunity classes. Basically, the idea is we want to group students of a similar ability, particularly those that have got high potential and are gifted and talented, so that specialist teaching materials and approaches can be used to best support them. Now, importantly, selective schools are unzoned, and so what that means is parents can apply and students can attend no matter where you live. There, of course, enrolments based on instead the performance in the selective schools test. Now, there are 17 fully selective schools in New South Wales, 25 partially selectives. This might mean that they have a selective school class that exists as a stream throughout the school, and there are 4 selective agricultural schools as well. The perhaps most well-known example is James Roos Agricultural, which is the #1 selective school and the #1 school in New South Wales. Now, each year when students take this test in Year 6, there's approximately a little over 4,000 places available. And as of yet, the selective schools test does still remain a paper-based test, unlike the OC test, which transitioned in 2021 to online. So tip number 1, practice, practice, practice. So the truth is that the OC and selective tests really, in terms of their format and style, are really very similar to the prior years of tests. And so what's really powerful about this is that one of the best ways to help a student get more confident about the OC and the selective test is to get them to actually do as many sample practice questions and past questions that are available so they can familiarize themselves with the style of the questions. And essentially just build that confidence so that when they see a certain type of question, they know how they should be trying to problem solve it to actually get to an answer. So practice, practice, practice is incredibly important. It's not about rote memorization, that's really, really key. It's fundamentally about exposure to questions to help students build familiarity with the problem-solving types and methods they may be needing to use. Now, really critically, particularly in the selective school exams, there's no time warnings that are given to students, and these exams are timed. There are time limits that students have to complete these. Now, for a lot of students, it may be the first time that they're actually, or one of the few times, they're doing a test under timed conditions. And that can often be something that can really cause a student to not be at their best, simply because of maybe some of the stress or some of the anxiety that can emerge from having a clock ticking down, sitting there in an exam hall, if it's the selective test as an example. And so when you're working with your child and getting them to actually do some of these practice questions and papers, you really critically want to actually have a timer. You want to do these in timed conditions. And the reason for this is you want to expose your child to those timed conditions in practice when it's relatively easy because there's no stresses, they're comfortable. So that way they get used to time, and they also get used to pacing themselves and knowing roughly how long they should be spending on each of the relevant sections of the paper. So that way when they're in the exam itself, they can be able to do that and self-regulate themselves from a time perspective. They can check the clock and they can make sure that they don't run out of time, which would be a real shame if they're actually incredibly capable, but that's the reason why they don't actually do their best on the test. So, really importantly, timed conditions is really, really key. That's going to be a powerful way when you're getting your child to do these practice tests to build their confidence, and it's often something that a lot of students and parents skip and don't do. They might do the practice tests, but they won't do it in timed conditions, and that is absolutely fundamental, and that's tip number 1. So tip number 2. Initially, treat every subject equally, and then over time, focus in on weak areas when you're practicing. So if we zoom out for a moment, we need to think about what are the components of the OC and the selective school test. So for example, the OC structure has 3 areas. It's got a reading, a mathematical skills, and a thinking skills section, and all of that will be multiple choice in format. Now the selective school structure is quite similar. It's got reading, mathematical reasoning, thinking skills, and then it's got one additional section which is writing. Now similar to the OC, the first 3, reading, mathematical reasoning, and thinking, are all multiple choice, exactly like the OC. So in many respects, the big difference between the selective and the OC test is we've got this additional writing skills section, which is an open response, where students are writing without multiple choice. Now, very quickly, let's look at what each of these sections entail, and then let's think about, as part of this tip, how students should approach both their preparation to help them get confident, but also then to help them maximize their results and their offers for the OC and selective test. So the reading section is designed to expose students to a variety of texts. This could be non-fiction, fiction, poetry, magazine articles, and reports as potential genres. So one of the things that you can do to really support your child getting more confident is to really expose them to these different types of text types and texts so that they become familiar with them and be able to recognize them, but also to be able to understand them. Now, this does of course happen throughout school, but it's one of the things that you can do beyond to just really ensure that they understand them, and also to push them to give them slightly more challenging versions of these text types. Now the mathematical reasoning section is basically where students are going to have to respond to questions, mathematical reasoning questions, without a calculator. And so this is where getting very, very strong on times tables and doing calculations in your head and also solving in pen and paper are going to be really, really important. So this really is about really getting a strong sense of fundamentals, particularly non-calculator fundamentals. Now, the thinking skills, which was previously known as general ability, really is about critical thinking and problem-solving skills. These are often questions that students haven't been exposed to at school, unlike the prior 2 areas in terms of the reading and the mathematical reasoning. So this is why in tip 1, doing practice questions and papers is so important, because this is an area that students can get quite confused by simply because they haven't had the exposure to it before. And finally, the writing section is where students will receive a topic to write about in the section. And really, the key here is not to have a pre-memorized response or a memorized story, because the prompts can be quite specific. And what they're looking for here is grammar, punctuation, spelling, and vocabulary, in addition to the creativity of the response and the ability of the response to actually write for a purpose and audience. So once again, this is designed at really supporting and examining students' fundamental writing skills and ability. Now, coming back to the tip at the beginning, now that we know what's involved here, Often students will have a natural talent or a passion for one of these areas. They might love maths, they might be a voracious reader, they could be an incredible writer and love creative writing. Now the challenge is if a student does incredibly well on one area of the test, it won't necessarily outweigh their performance in another area that they're really struggling with. And that's because the weighting process will end up weighting each of these sections evenly. And so what that means is in an initial couple of runs through, looking at some practice sample papers, students want to really do the entire paper and build that overall familiarity with each of the different sections. That's going to be really important to build confidence in that pattern recognition. But once they've done that, what you want to really be looking at using one of the sample tests as a diagnostic, and of course students, sort of feedback from, the teacher's feedback on your child from school, reports and the like, is to identify are there areas, whether or not it's the writing, it's the reading, it's the mathematical reasoning, where they're struggling a little bit more. And that's an area then that you actually want to dive in and try to do some concerted, targeted work on, really to support them to build up those foundational skills, whether or not that's in their mathematical reasoning and their non-calculator problem solving, whether or not that's in their ability to read more complex texts of varying text types, or whether or not that's in actually their fundamentals of writing, their creative, innovation, or in the sort of grammar, syntax, punctuation. So it's really critical that you want to ultimately do well across all areas of the text, all areas of the test, I should say, because that's going to maximize the results in the offer because they get weighted evenly. But the way to get there is actually through identifying, using some diagnostics through past tests, where the weak areas are that are going to need a little bit of extra support to nudge them in the right direction. Tip number 3. Review the mistakes. So as we highlighted in tip number 2, doing a practice paper and using it as a diagnostic is incredibly powerful. Right? It's going to help you get a sense of where your child needs some further work and some growth. But as they do papers and practice questions, they're going to make mistakes. That's almost inevitable. Now those mistakes though are really powerful because they're actually insights into exactly the areas for growth that a student might need to work on. And sometimes it's not actually because they don't understand the material. It could be that they made a silly mistake. It could be that they just didn't quite apply the right problem solving method. There could be a number of reasons as to what went wrong. And so ultimately what we want to try to do here in this final step, which is so important, is actually pay attention to the mistakes. And so not just for a student to do a test, to get a tick across, and then go, great, you got this score, let's move on. But instead to go back over that test with your child and look at, well, okay, why did they think that that was the correct answer? Like, what was their process? And then, okay, what was the correct answer here? And what went wrong and how could the student have corrected it? So you're essentially spending a little bit of focused time doubling down on the mistakes that students made, but really importantly supporting them build the correct approach to solve that question correctly, so that you're also then building their confidence for future papers and questions that they might be exposed to. So really importantly, tip number 3 is don't ignore the mistakes. Actually review them and spend concerted time working through them with your child. And in time, what you can do as well, which can be really fantastic, is instead of explaining to your child necessarily, well, here's how you got it wrong, is to highlight, look, you got this one wrong. Can you explain to me, one, how you did it, but then also why you got it wrong and how this is actually the correct answer. And what that does is it forces the student to start to problem solve it for themselves and help them to start reverse engineer, okay, well, if that's the correct answer, well, okay, here's maybe how I got it wrong and here's how it's correct. Now, of course, that's going to be something that you're going to progress to as they get more confident with the material, because that is more of an advanced strategy that you could use depending on where your child is at and their level for the particular question or the topic or the challenge that they're working through. So there we have it. Those are the 3 big tips in how to support your child navigate OC and selective school testing, I should say, successfully. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is one day and it is one exam, and sometimes it can mean that students aren't simply at their best. Our hope, though, is through the 3 tips we've shared here, you're going to have a really clear framework and some things that you can do as a parent that will better support your child be at their best on the particular day so they can get a great result and hopefully get a number of offers for both OC or a selective school. If there's anything we can do at ArtaSmart to support you on that journey, let us know. We've got an incredible team of one-on-one tutors that can work with your child one-on-one through the steps that we've just been unpacking with you to help them do their best if it's something that you yourself don't feel equipped to be able to do. Otherwise, if you have any questions, leave them below in the comments and our team will do our best to come back to you and support you on the journey.